ultimate manifestation of democracy is totalitarianism. And what is totalitarianism? It's when everyone is involved in politics. So by this process of emancipation, political emancipation, that is the spreading of the voting rights, let's say, electoral rights to wider and wider audiences, we are making the totalitarian society possible. Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. In this video I shall briefly discuss the very basic picture of governance, at least the governance of national states, that is the situation that we have since the middle of the 17th century, or if we're talking about national states proper, it's like since the beginning of 19th century. But the modernity in general, right? So in my topic about the esoteric knowledge, I'm going to link it in the description. I've already talked, mentioned a little bit, the various forms of informal governance, right? When you have the same hierarchical structure, may have an esoteric circle with a certain type of morality and knowledge, and like the exoteric, the outer circle, with very different amount of knowledge and a very different morality. Okay, and here I wish to continue it as well, because again, it's essential, as we shall see, to the existence of the modern national states. Okay, so let's look at their genesis. Again, it's the middle of the 17th century, right? It's the Peace Treaty of Westphalia. It's when the centralized states basically appeared for the first time in history. So we have these new centralized states with their bureaucracy, right? And France might be the very first example of such state in the first place. And again, as we remember, France was also the first nation to appear after the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century, right? So this centralized state has to manage taxation, it has to maintain a big army, it has to maintain and build infrastructure, things like that. So in order to do all of that, you need a big bureaucracy, all right? You need to control all of this stuff, manage all of it, etc. So as your state grows, the bureaucracy grows naturally as well. So at some point, this bureaucracy becomes so thick that the ruling class, the elites, cannot pass their laws anymore through this bureaucracy. Like bureaucracy might say, well, okay, guys, we can have a mind of our own, right? Or some sort of minister might say, well, why the heck would I do what these guys say? I have my own ministry, I have my own people, I can control stuff on my own, right? And so the governance by the elites governance of the regular people, let's say, by the elites becomes disrupted. So you have to do something about it. I mean, the elites would like to do something about it, let's say, and they do. So they introduce additional informal tools to sort of bypass this thick bureaucracy and eventually subjugate it, actually, to their wills. And to do that, they're trying to actually recruit the basic, overall population in their favor, like the simple people, basically. So with this being made, the ministers can no longer do what they wish to do or what they might have wished to do, because they have on one end the elites sort of against them, like biding their own will, like channeling their own will through the bureaucracy, through the ministers. And on the other side, they are being pressured from below, so to speak, by the regular population. So this is what we're going to be talking about in this video. So it's how the elites recruit the regular people, the democratic majority, in order to suppress the bureaucracy and make the passing of the will of the elites to the general population as easy as possible. This is what we're talking about here. This three-step pyramid, you might say, where we have the bottommost layer is the general population, the middle layer is bureaucracy. Actually, it's not only bureaucracy, it's like the middle class as well. It's like the people who can actually, who have some sort of control over their own lives and potentially some other people's lives, alright? So it's bureaucracy, middle class, something like that, all right? But I'm going to be just generally calling this bureaucracy. So general population, bureaucracy, and the elites, all right? The elites recruit general population in order to suppress bureaucracy, basically. This is what is going on. So in order to do that, again, the elites have to invent or, discover, or whatever other verb you prefer, construct, perhaps, this third estate, the general population. They have to recruit this third estate in their favor, right? For their own benefit. So you might know that the classic three estates are what is clergy, aristocracy, aka nobles, and like peasants and bourgeoisie is the third estate, right? But we're going to be talking about more raw, in terms of like the amount of power, more raw picture, which, so our three estates would be like nobles, the elites, including the monarchy, bureaucracy and the middle class, and the third estate is the general public, the democratic majority, basically. So the rulers use, aka the elites, use the informal tools to get the popular support, which is then used to bound bureaucracy to their will. This is what is happening. And you might say, well, there may be situations where bureaucracy would actually revolt against this, like actively revolt. And there are such situations. Like one example I can give you is a coup d'etat, like, for example, a formation of some sort of military junta, right? Something like that. It's basically the bureaucracy striking back, you might say. All right. Okay, so one of such tools of informal subjugation of the public and bureaucracy through proxy, right, is for example, a two-party system which exists in the most powerful nations in the last 200 years, which are the United States and the Britain, right? The hegemons of the 19th and 20th century, the hegemon and sub-hegemon, basically. So, well, of course, in 19th century, the sub-hegemon was France, but it's a different story. Britain doesn't even have a formal separation of powers, for example, right? It has a very interesting way of governance, let's put it this way, but it completely falls into the picture that I've described here, where the elites use the popular opinion to subjugate the bureaucracy, right? And the same happens in the United States, right? But the Britain only recently have started implementing these separation of power principles of Montesquieu. And even now it's mostly for show, it's mostly for Europeans not being able to sabotage the British system, ideologically sabotage, that is. Right, and other examples of such systems would be a single-party system, which is basically the same two-party system, but even more grotesque, even more clownish, you might say. So where, everyone is a party member, like it was in the USSR, or in China. Well, not really everyone, but you know what I mean, right? There's only one party that you can be a member of in the first place. So, yeah. Elites, of course, do control the popular opinion through propaganda and various psychological operations. So this is like one way of the subjugation. We'll talk about another, even more important way in a few minutes. But one way, let's say, most popular ideological framework under which this subjugation happens, that is the recruitment of the general population in favor of the elites, all right? So one very popular framework for that is the Church of Social Democracy, for example. And when I'm saying that it's a church, I'm not exaggerating. It's actually a church, almost literally. Like Freemasons are a church, even in a formal sense, but the Social Democrats is a church as well, okay? With its own religious rituals, with its own code, etc., the scripture, you might say, etc., etc. And the welfare state is obviously the main the physical manifestation of the Church of Social Democracy, you might say. So it was created by the elites to suppress the bureaucracy, the middle class, right? So roughly speaking, well, imagine, I'll give you an example so you would like grasp the the idea that I'm talking about. Like, why social democracy? Like, well, what is social democracy? It's populism, right? It's eat the rich, like give the poor people more money. Like, oh, this president is ours. He's a working man, right? Something, a working class man, etc., etc., etc. So imagine on a smaller scale a situation like that. Like, we have a bunch of rich families who like hire CEOs to control their property, like, you know, just some large, you know, whatever property, like the businesses and whatnot. So these CEOs think, I'm actually kind of rich and powerful, so maybe I have to, you know, go get into politics, you know, maybe I actually have to, maybe I'm actually able to transform my financial resources in actual political resources, right? And then what happens is the elites say, well, no, you're not, because you know why? Because we produce this thing called Occupy Wall Street right here, so you would know your place, you know, you Mr. Rich guy. So, Mr. Bureaucrat / middle class guy, right? Of course, again, bureaucracy and middle class, I'm using these terms very vaguely, right? But this is the situation I'm talking about, where the elites conjure, basically the elites utilizing general population and like populistic sentiments, etc., including the welfare state, including social democracy, including things like communism, whatever, you name it, in order to suppress the middle class, aka / bureaucracy, right? And yeah, the same happens with the state as a whole. Again, the Church of Social Democracy really works. Okay, you might ask, well, what happens during the revolutions then? Like, I'm describing like the normal state of operation of the state, no pun intended. But during the revolution, I would say the system doesn't change. What changes is the elites themselves, right? It's some sort of rotation in the elites. Perhaps some of the elites are getting completely kicked out, right? Something like that. But the practice has shown that this mechanism that I've just described is the only and the most, well, maybe not the only, but the most viable mechanism for maintenance of large-scale, big power type of national state, all right? This three-step pyramid that we're talking about, with the elites recruiting the lowest step in order to counteract the middle one, right? And basically, virtually establishing a total control over the whole system. So, again, an example of like a bureaucratic revolution, that is when the middle class and bureaucracy says, okay, we can't tolerate this anymore, we have to have a voice of our own. What happens is the demolition of the state itself, more or less. This situation is extremely unstable when bureaucracy becomes super big and comes out of control of the elites or the population, or both of them simultaneously. So yeah, in this case, the nation, the state as we know it, aka, you know, Westphalia-ish state, ceases to exist, basically. Again, either in the form of military junta, which again would probably cease to exist pretty soon, or be exchanged for another junta and another, like you know, Latin American style, or in the form of anarchism, like in Somalia. Like Somalia, you might say, is the country of the where the bureaucracy and the middle class have succeeded. Like, again, okay, it's a different separate topic. I'm not gonna talk about this here. But again, the results of such a revolt from the middle, so to speak, are short-lived anyway. Actually, if you think about it, Roman and Greek societies were based on more or less the same scheme that I've just described to you, this recruitment of the lowest step of the hierarchy by the highest step in order to subjugate the mid step, so to speak. So in Greece, for example, Aristotle was talking about the forms of governance such as monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, among others. And he said, actually, maybe there were only three. Like, there were like bad forms of these three as well. But anyway, so monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, all right? And he said that basically in order to have a stable system, rather than, let's say, rotation between these three, you have to actually have a mixed system with all three included simultaneously. And this is more or less what we're talking about. The monarchy, the elites, the aristocracy, the bureaucracy in our case, right, the middle class, and democracy, aka the general public. All three should work together in some sort of rhythm, so to speak, to keep a functioning, stable societal system. And back then it was more or less the same. Again, the alliances of Greek policies worked like that, at least the stable ones. The Roman Empire functioned like that, etc., etc. But now we have, with national states, we have the same situation, but on a much larger scale, all right? And again, the best examples are the United States and Britain. And actually, right now, the European Union is another example of that. But again, by proxy, other states in the world work more or less the same, but they don't really matter, right? The world is basically the US, EU, and UK. Okay. So, one interesting thing to note is that the so-called public intellectuals are also a part of the elite, essentially. They are a tool of subjugation of the general public, essentially. And that's why when a public intellectual becomes really influential and does a good job in subjugating the general public, they become, you know, they receive knightship, for example, in Britain. They receive all kinds of awards from the elites, etc., etc. What else can be noted here? The actual democratic process, right? You might say, well, how do, like on the technical side, how do the elites recruit the general public? Well, it's through the elections, right? But you might say, well, during the elections, it's actually the vice versa, right? We are electing the president, not the president elects us or anything like that, right? But, unfortunately, the actual elections are just a ritual, all right? They don't really mean anything in themselves. So what matters is you might say, sociology behind the elections. Then, yeah, sure, this matters because the elites use this sociological studies of the society. Again, I'm apologizing for this tautology, but anyway, they use it to actually understand what would be the most viable way to subjugate the public, to, let's say, recruit the public against the bureaucracy, right? To keep the system stable. And stable meaning working in favor of the elites, right? Without any disruption by the bureaucracy, aka middle class. So, you arrive at this situation where, on the one hand, the democracy is controlled, not the democracy, like the elites and bureaucracy are controlled by the people, supposedly, right? But on the other hand, the people are controlled by participation. And this is something that nobody really talks about, but which is hugely important, and I would argue much more important, just by virtue of general public being much more numerous in literal sense than everything else in society. So this is actually the most important thing, that the public, the people, is controlled by the participation in the democratic process. Because if you think about it, voting is just a franchise, all right? It's the delegation of your rights to other people. So almost by definition, by participating in the democratic process, you are pledging, you know, your, how do they call it? Basically, you are announcing that you are ready to serve the elites, right? By participation in politics, people confirm that they are willing to submit to the system and to the ruling elites. So the state and the elites that it represents subjugates wider and wider audiences by letting them vote. Like, this is what we observe historically, like the voting rights are being, you know, more and more inclusive. So more and more people can be actually drawn into this orbit of politics and start participating in politics, and thus be subjugated by the elites, essentially. So, it's really elegant and simple, if you think about it. Like, again, a simple example, like, let's imagine, that you're a slave in, I don't know, like early 19th century or 18th century or whatever. So you cannot vote. You don't really have any rights, if you think about it. Your master has all the rights, like, on top of you. Like, they can do to you more or less what they want, right? But, and the master is the one who votes, for example, right? Your master. But now, voila, we're in the 21st century. You are now a free person instead of being a slave. You now can vote, and you have no master above you except for the state. So what happened is basically you became a property of the state instead of being a property of your master. Hopefully you can see like where this is going, like what do I mean by that, right? Now only the elites have power above you, over you. You don't have a master. Like, this ruling class, this middle ground of, let's say, slave owners was eliminated. Now, well, basically silenced, you know, something like that. So now you have the elites recruiting the previous slaves and like fighting the bureaucracy, right? Now it's only the elites who can have their will directly implemented in the society. By inclusion of wider and wider masses, wider and wider public into the democratic process. So now everyone has to be involved. And what does it mean? Well, technically, from a politological point of view, you might call it totalitarianism. So, and that's why I would claim here that the ultimate manifestation of democracy is totalitarianism. And what is totalitarianism? It's when everyone is involved in politics. So by this process of emancipation, political emancipation, that is the spreading of the voting rights, let's say, electoral rights to wider and wider audiences, we are making the totalitarian society possible, right? The totalitarianism of the mid-20th century, early to mid-20th century, was actually like the most, let's say, raw form of this process. Of course, now it's the same, it's just more covert, let's say. Like, people say, okay, certain people with mustache have a bad reputation, so we shouldn't actually be as overt, be as open about it as we have been previously. Even though if you look at even at the United States, if you look at the United Kingdom, they've been pretty open about these things as well at this time of the 20th century, right? But now it's more covert. Now it's more closed, closeted, you might say, right? So now we have the situation where bureaucracy is completely subjugated by the elites because they've managed to recruit the whole of society in their favor, and the society is sort of happy because they think they actually can do something, you know, their vote matters, etc., etc., whereas in fact it doesn't. And we have basically a functioning totalitarian regime, right? And again, the recent couple of years have probably demonstrated you that, yeah, it actually is pretty much a totalitarian regime, and you can't do anything. Like, there is no middle class. It's completely silenced, right? The middle class, the bureaucracy, the smaller aristocrats, roughly speaking, you know, who could have been in the opposition to the ruling elites. Now they are completely silenced by, again, the illusory character of democracy in practice and in essence a totalitarian regime that we have because of that. But again, the totalitarianism is founded on the complete inclusivity. Everyone has to be into politics, right? And that's the difference between totalitarian and authoritarian regimes, which I've noted in some of my videos previously, is that totalitarian regime requires full inclusivity, whereas authoritarian regime is vice versa. It's the elites saying, no, you give us the right to do what we want, and we just, we won't touch you, basically, right? That's like the social contract between the elites and the society in authoritarianism. All right. So the last note I wish to make here is that I've mentioned already some time ago the informal governance and potential ideological sabotage, etc., which is basically the war on the ideological front, you might say, which the elites may wage against each other. So the current proxy war, again, watch my video, Ukraine special, if you want. I'm gonna link it in the description if you want to know more details. But again, the war in Ukraine, so-called, is the proxy war between the United States and European Union, and there is also a British factor in all of this, obviously. The UK, as the former sub-hegemon and now the third power in the world after the US and the EU, they always might come up with some funny things. And so recent, let's say, news pieces about Hunter Biden's laptop, you know, or Epstein's ring of connoisseurs, if you, if you might call it that. It's basically like people somehow, like, again, you have to have this general framework that I've just given to you to even be able to perceive it like that. But I believe that these psy-ops, by any like estimation, are actually, again, the operation of the American intelligence against the British intelligence. So what happens is, in Britain, historically, the intelligence have used blackmail and things like that to, again, control various people all the time. But what Americans are saying by leaking all of these documents and Hunter Biden's laptop and the info about the Epstein's ring of connoisseurs to the general public is they're basically making a gesture towards British intelligence saying, we cannot be blackmailed by this. Like, the public already knows that we are all connoisseurs and, you know, that we have some fun in our free time and not necessarily in a free time even. So you can't possibly sabotage our political system by revealing these facts, because we have actually revealed these facts ourselves and everything is fine. Like, people, like the public is okay with these things, right? So it's basically the leakage of this info is a special operation of American intelligence, an antidote, you might say, a vaccine, right, against the British intelligence and its potential sabotage towards the American elites. So, yeah. Oh, yeah, but Europeans, of course, still have to say some things about this. Like, I'm pretty sure in the nearest future, like a couple of decades tops, perhaps even earlier, the world would become suddenly concerned. Of course, that will be a special operation of the European elites, the European intelligence. The world will become suddenly concerned with various misdeeds of the United States in places like Latin America, Africa, Southeast Asia, etc., like human rights violations and things like that, in the Middle East perhaps, while the Europeans themselves would say, well, we are already super inclusive, everything is fine on our end, like the colonialism is the thing of the like centuries past. You guys, Americans, have something interesting, you know, in your closet, some skeletons, right? But okay, again, that's a separate discussion for another day, which may not even have. Maybe you'll hear it in the news tomorrow, who knows, or a year after, but whatever. Yeah, so today we talked about this three-step pyramid of the national state with the general public, bureaucracy / middle class, and the elites. And I've told you the story how the elites recruit the public against the bureaucracy / middle class and thus solidify their own rule, basically unifying the whole pyramid in a trilateral political orgasm or something like that, all right? Of course, to some detriment, through some detriment to the bureaucracy and the middle class, and ultimately the inability to change and the establishment of a complete totalitarian monolith. What happens next is the creation of the civilization states, but then again, it's another story for another day. But the national states, this is how they work. One of the tools, the key tool for the elites to recruit the general public is democracy and social democracy in particular, right? The welfare state. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for watching. The eons are closing.